I think most people feel really lonely when you want something that doesn't currently exist. And so some people call that dreams, some people call that goals, whatever it is. You're trying to pull something from your mind into reality and you want it done a certain way. And if it's not done that way, it's not what you imagined. And so people on the outside will throw stones and call you names that they think will change your behavior and get you to stop. And the more I have been the person trying to pull things into reality, the more I've tried to weather and build kind of defenses against those things so that when those stones get hurled at you by being called a control freak or by saying you micromanage things or that you have incredibly high standards, the answer is yes, because I want it done right the first time. Because either way, if you have enough will, it's going to get done the way that I want it to get done regardless. And it'll be less painful if we just do it right the first time, because we will still have to do it. And you may have to do it 3 or 4 more times, but eventually you will just succumb to the fact that we're going to do it this way. And I think all of the great things that have happened for humanity have been from one man or woman who had an idea and just wouldn't let people shake it from them. The level of detail, I mean, it's the difference between a book that gets 10 or 100 5-star reviews and a book that gets 100,000 5-star reviews. And everyone wants a silver bullet, but most of the things that make great products is 100 golden BBs. And so that's one of those things we have is there's no silver bullets, only hundreds of golden BBs. There's just hundreds of tiny little improvements. It's like, how can we look at the can? How can we improve the way it ships? What about the weight? What about the color scheme? How does it sit on the shelves? How are people going to look at it in this market versus this market? Or like, how does this name appear on hats and on shirts and on sites? And what's the RGB, whatever the color scope is here versus there? And it's just 1,000 details that someone who does not care will not put the work to look into because they're trying to check a box rather than to make something that people will love. Or I heard this from, I can't remember who it was from, but basically that the best art is art where the artist makes it for themselves. And where you see commercial work is where a bunch of people are trying to make something for an audience. And so they're trying to like rinse and recycle stuff that actually solves no one's problems because no one is actually the audience. Whereas when you make it for yourself, there's thousands of people just like you who will have the same depth of understanding of it, but it feels selfish in the moment to make something for yourself. But when you make it for yourself, you actually make it for everyone. It makes sense for the majority of people to be opposed to that because you do make more work for everyone else. But the product of that work is so much better. And so if you want the work that you have to last and to be meaningful and make an impact, it comes from 100 golden BBs of 100 particularities, of 100 peculiarities that you are picky about because the whole thing needs to work. And what happens is if you have a big project, lots of people have to get involved, but there still needs to be one vision. And otherwise it looks like a Frankenstein where everyone just checks a box of something they did in the past. They just copy and paste it over. And then it doesn't resonate with anyone because again, they just did it for everyone rather than for the artist. And so using that as a frame has given me permission to be me in an unreasonable world. And so like I told this last time I was on, but when I did the book launch, I practiced that presentation 3 times a day, every day for 30 days. So I did 100 run-throughs, full length run-throughs. First where I did it out loud and recorded it. Second time where I would watch the recording and then edit in real time and then do it again. And I did that every single day. And so then when I came live and had 500,000 people or whatever, it came out, I think, flawlessly. But people were like, man, you're such a natural at this. It's like, well, I did it 100 times. And so sometimes people even hear 100 and it's just a big number. But when you do 100 repetitions of something, the first 5 times you're like, wow, I'm so much better. But then like the difference between 5 and the next 95 times is what goes from being great to being a masterpiece. And like, it's that next 95 that I think is what makes people world class. And that's where everyone falls off. And that's why most people aren't. People want you to do what they find comfortable. And most things that are like most companies deteriorate when the founder leaves because it happens slowly because you go from 100 golden BBs to 99 golden BBs and it doesn't look that different. And then there's 98 golden BBs and they're like, I don't know. And then 2 years later, 3 years later, you're like, I don't know. It doesn't have the same like magic as what it was. And that's because the art behind it isn't there because it's not unified anymore. It's not congruent anymore. It's 100 departments making decisions with people copying, pasting things for an audience that doesn't exist, rather than one person who's trying to be satisfied for an ideal that they are trying with all their might to live up to. Most people who claim to be perfectionists are not perfectionists. They're actually procrastinating because they're not doing anything.
Correct.
And so it just is a socially acceptable label, because the real perfectionists feel this sickness where they like want to itch their skin off until the thing's done, but they are trying to get it done. Whereas the perfectionist or the procrastinator uses that to say, like, I'm not sure, I'm just getting it right. But like the person who's an actual perfectionist, one wants to finish and is working every hour of every day on the thing and seeing progress towards it. Because if you don't know how your thing is getting better, you're not a perfectionist, you're just ignorant. If we knew how people responded ahead of time to content, then we would make things differently than we do. But I, probably like you, am often surprised, pleasantly and sometimes unpleasantly, by the stuff that just grabs hold and then just goes, viral as hell in content. And so I think part of that is making up for our own ignorance by increasing volume. And so that would be like my reframe on the perfectionism there is like, we know that if we make 10 pieces of content, it is more likely that we will have more people see it than if we try really hard at one. And so we make 10 because the net benefit of the 10 is greater. Correct. And so that's the ideal that we commit to. There's a teacher and he's got 2 classes that he teaches. And one class, he says, the only assignment for this whole semester is that you come back with a perfect clay pot. That's it. That's the assignment. The other class, he says, your objective is to make the most total quantity of clay pots, and you'll be measured by how many pots you make. And at the end of the quarter, the pots that came from the team that had to just make sheer volume, not only did they make more pots, but the quality of all of their pots was better compared to the teams that only had to make one. And it just underlines the biggest lesson that I've learned in my life, which is that volume negates luck, is that you can try to be lucky and pick the one perfect thing and try and make it, but if you don't want to try and be lucky, you can just do so much fucking work that you will brute force your way to figuring it out. Like if you do 1,000 podcasts, you'll be pretty fucking good at podcasts, right? But if you try to say, okay, you're brand new, and all you have to do is make one perfect podcast. The problem is that you don't have the perspective from which to make a judgment to say what is good, because you have zero data to base anything off of. And so you're basing your idea of a perfect podcast on something that you've literally never done before. And so doing the volume gives you the perspective to then have the best podcast at number 1,000 or 1,001. So I define learning by same condition, new behavior. And so when you go to a video game and you battle through the level and you battle the boss, if you keep doing the same thing to the boss and you keep losing, then you have not learned, because you have the same condition and the same behavior. And so I often say that, like, for anyone who's listening to this podcast, if the goal is to get better and you're like, man, I really want to learn something from this podcast. If you listen to this podcast and then you're in the same exact conditions as you were before, and then you do not change your behavior, you learned nothing. And so using that definition has at least allowed me to change my behavior faster, which then goes into rate of learning, which I define as intelligence. And so a lot of people are like, man, he's so smart, but he just doesn't. It's like, well, then if he doesn't change his behavior and he's in the same conditions, he's a dummy. He's not that smart. And so if you are trying to battle the same boss over and over again, and you don't change what you're doing, and the boss keeps beating you, then it's not the game's problem. It's your problem. You are the problem. And I think that's like if you continue. I talked about, obviously I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, but I usually do this when I have a crowd. I just say, like, hey, raise your hand if you work all the hours of the day. And a lot, most of the crowd raised their hand. I say, okay, who here has been stuck at the same revenue level for 6 months or more? And then I say, keep the hands up. And like, honestly, most of the time, the same hands are raised. I say, you're doing the wrong shit. Like, if you put all your inputs and the outputs haven't changed, then you have the same condition and the same behavior. And so you have learned nothing. And so that has always just been my reframe. And so over time, if you're moving up in entrepreneurship, you're moving up in career, your behavior should change, because it means you've learned. Yeah, when I was getting started in my entrepreneurial journey, and I would say this is like this. I was when I was an entrepreneur, right? Like I hadn't quit my job yet. I started reading all these self-help books, and I remember reading like it was probably like my 10th book in a row, and I realized that the words in that book contradicted like the second self-help book that one was like it's all about goals, the other one's like it's all about taking steps or whatever it was, right? And I all of a sudden I was like, my life is the same. I've read all these books, but I still literally live in the exact same condo in Baltimore doing the same job. Like nothing has changed. And so I just made the commitment that whatever the next book that I was going to read, I would just not read another book until I'd done everything in that book. And that's when I quit my job and I did a whole bunch of other things. And I've actually more or less stuck with that in terms of like when I read books or even listen to podcasts, I usually do it with an intention to get something out of it. And I usually have notes up. And so my intake on information, because I get asked a lot, I'm sure you do. Like I actually don't read that much. I definitely don't read nonfiction. I read like fantasy every once in a while.
Red Rising, baby.
That's right. But it's because usually I get overwhelmed with the amount of things I would have to do. And so I'm like, I don't need more information. I'm good. Like I could read a chapter and be like, all right, that's it. It'll take me 2 weeks to do this. And so then like the rest of the time is doing that. I would make the argument that I wouldn't have gone backwards because I would have gained the experience. And so I would have more context to know what the second thing was going to be. And that's just kind of like the trial by fire, learning through iteration. And I think I tend to do more of that.
Sort of a win or learn philosophy.
Yeah. And I would say that like there are entrepreneurs who are definitely like super, super duper planners. And there are entrepreneurs who are more like, let's just move and break shit and we'll figure it out. I tend to be really this on the micro in terms of like move shit and break, like we'll figure it out as we go. And I just tend to be a planner only in the big, like very grand, like what do I really want to do in 10 years? But the majority of the time it's like, let's see. And we'll learn. I've learned so much, like so much of the content that I have comes from just fucking up in business. And people are like, this is such original content. I was like, this is just because that's what my life was. I made this mistake and it didn't work. But I said this one thing one time and then all these people bought and I was like, ooh, how do I do that again? And so like, it was always through iteration. And I've read all these books, but there's just knowing how, knowing that and knowing how. Like knowing that maybe this works, maybe. But once you do it, it's a different type of learning where, at least for me, it's been that way. If you could read 100 books on sales, but when you take your first cold call, all of that goes out the window because you actually have to sell.